This is the Unrationed Podcast. My name's Evan,
I'm Josh.
I am Tony.
and we begin every podcast by talking through our wild moments from the week. Josh, what you got?
So my wife and I did a little baby moon this weekend. We have our third kiddo coming in December, and so we got away to Telluride, Colorado, which is just a gem of a place. So yesterday morning, I got out pretty early, around 6 a.m. or something. That the sun wasn't out yet, and I ran up this place called Bear Creek. And up at the top of the route, which was, I don't know, like 2.5 miles up, um, there was just this immaculate waterfall, and there was like ice all over it, super cold. Yeah, so I got in the waterfall, and that was very, very cold. So yeah, that was my wild moment. I ran back down. Well, actually, I like hung out on this big rock. It was just this massive, massive boulder, and it just looked down this huge valley. Sent a nice little video to Tony and Evan. But yeah, it was really amazing. Got to see the sunrise in that valley. The aspens were incredible. The waterfall was incredible. So felt very wild. Didn't see a single human, and got to see some elk. So yeah, all around very good.
That is very wild.
Mine is
Tony, how
similar.
about you?
My I wasn't present for this one, but we have a thing in our house where we distract the little one by saying, oh, "Is there something outside?" Outside the window. So we look out the window to see if there's a monster or a bear or whatnot. And Seville did this a couple of days ago, where they were in the room, and the baby was her. She's not really a baby at this point. She's a genuine toddler.
Mhm.
At 19 months, she's, you know, Seville picks her up and says, "Oh, is there? Look, let's look out. Oh, is there a?" And sure enough, Sky looks out the back, and she goes, "Cow!" And it was a white-tailed deer in the backyard. Just right out the door. She was the first one to see it. And we'll work on the animal identification, but yeah, it was so adorable. Evan.
So I think the first thing my dad does when he wakes up in the morning, the last thing he does before he goes to bed at night, is check next door for any free things to see if there's anything that his neighbors are getting rid of that he would like to go pick up. And so I've benefited from this habit of his a few times whenever he sees something really good. One of his finds this week wasn't something that was free, but it was a very good deal, was a weight set for the basement. And so I've worked out one good time since getting that, and muscles are sore in a way that I haven't felt since what I would call youth. And I know if I were listening to this in older years, I would say, well, you are still youth. But my younger years, whenever I spent more time in the gym, and there's something to that feeling. There's like a familiarity with that soreness that I haven't felt in a very long time. And that felt really nice. It feels wild pushing heavy weights around. Like I'm a different person than last time I did something like this. And so yeah, it feels different and familiar at the same time. So and I would say I would not be running or lifting weights without Wilds and the Woods this year. That's for sure. So it feels like what we're doing here has been a catalyst for even having the desire to get back to that type of activity and build strength in a very physical and metaphorical and mental and emotional and everything else way. So that's my wild moment.
Yeah, buddy.
So I was thinking today we would run through what it means to be a dad. I don't think we've done a podcast on what it means to be a dad. And knowing the two of you as men and fathers, I know it's something that you've thought a lot about. So this is somewhat a selfish episode where I'm like, I would love to learn from Josh and Tony what they think it means to be a dad, and what are some of their guiding principles or stories. What are some things our dads did that we want to do, uh, just kind of go down that rabbit trail and talk about being a father. Does that sound good to you guys?
Sounds awesome.
Both of your wild moments too. We kind of had two topics that we were toggling back and forth with before we began the podcast, and I didn't know your wild moments yet, but they both involved your children, which as you were talking about them, I was like, man, I need to come up with one that was with my kids this week, but I didn't force a wild moment for the sake of performance. So what are your thoughts on being a dad?
It's funny that you bring this up. I was processing this over the weekend. So it's like a 7 hour, or it was about a 6 hour drive from Colorado Springs to Telluride. And I remember this like vivid moment, we're like 5 hours into the drive. And I was thinking about like being a dad and how much my identity is wrapped up in it. And normally like you hear like, oh, don't you have your title be your identity and don't have this be your identity. And then I started thinking about fatherhood. I was like, that should totally be like very alive in my identity. And same thing like being a husband for me personally. And so it's something that I want to be excellent at all the time. And I know I'm going to have like failures and everything. But this weekend, it was, Laura and I, my wife, we had a ton of time thinking about parenthood. We had a ton of time thinking about being the best versions of ourselves for our kids. And I'm like proud and I want being a dad, like one of the leading things as part of my identity, and not being, ashamed of that, fearful of that, just embrace it fully. So that's what's top of mind right now. Just really leaning into that all the time.
What is it? What are some things that means to you? Like what's wrapped up in that identity, as far as meaning or behavior, or like what does that look like to you?
I think there's times where I make decisions in my life and like, am I being the best leader for so and so? Or am I making the best business decision? And I think I need to interject the same level of discipline and intentionality around, am I being the best father with this decision? Even if I'm making a business decision, even if I'm making something to prioritize on my own, like, day-to-day habits. And so it's just part of like the first thing in a decision-making criteria of like, am I being the best father that I can be? Is this going to take me away from my family, or is it going to enable something with my family? And so when I think about that, it's just one of the primary criteria that the lens that I look through for every decision that I make. And I mean, just like everybody, I fall very, very short, very, very frequently. However, trying to always train myself to be honoring that role and making sure you can feel that, in the decisions that I make on a daily basis.
Yeah. Tony, what you got?
When Wilder was born, I was working on a song that actually still has never been finished, much to my chagrin and my wife's. But there was a line in it that says, You can split my life clearly into two. There was the time before, and then once I saw you." And it is a defining moment, right? And I talked about some tattoos last week, and this brings up another one. But Seville and I have been talking recently where she mentioned um, that I need to get a tattoo for my daughter. Say, I have this kind of bow and arrow. There we go. I have this bow and arrow tattooed on my forearm, um, from when Wilder was born. And as I've been thinking about it, it's more like that tattoo and I'll refer to what it what it means in a second, but that while I got it on the birth of my son, it's more of one commemorating or memorializing that transition from a man without children to a man with children. Um, and it's a reference to Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, this part on children, and this passage that says, um, the archer sees his mark upon the path of the infinite and bends you with his might so that the arrows may go swift and far. Let your bending under the archer's hand be for gladness, for just as he loves the arrow that flies, so too does he love the bow that is stable. You know what? And I actually forgot the beginning of that. I screwed that up. The beginning of it is, um, your children are living arrows, and now I think I need to get a tattoo for both my kids. but that is how I think about it. That it's, we talked about constraints on the podcast last week, and becoming a father being this most beautiful of constraints, where your heart is on the outside and attached to another person who is naturally going to grow up and get more independent and go away, and the cycle continues. And even with my kids being 18 months or whatever and 4, I'm already feeling that that tension of their growing and um, becoming more independent. But how's that for a framing?
The bow and arrow is quite.
Yeah.
I was trying to make a pun with how it's a really good metaphor and picture for what we're talking about, or what it means to me to be a dad. And I think there's somewhere in the Bible where it's talking about having children in your youth is like a quiver full of arrows. So it lends itself to that passage from the prophet as well. There's a tension that the arrow that the bow needs to launch a child as well, or launch an arrow, mixing metaphors there. That seems accurate. Can you share more of your thoughts about the arrow specifically and what it means to you? Like, can you break down that metaphor? Are there the pulling back, the letting go, the launching, the flying straight? Have you broken those pieces down and thought about them specifically?
Sure. Well, I think you pretty much did just break it down, but but the there's this desire, this really intense desire to always be with my children, or to always protect them, um, in a way that, in our culture today, we have this idea of the helicopter parent, right? Where it's we're we're trying to reduce risk and reduce dangers, and maybe even eliminate them, right, in a way that's not natural, and arguably not healthy. That the the purpose of the parent is to be a bow, where the arrow is not doing its thing. The arrow is meant to fly, right? That's the purpose of the arrow. And the purpose of the bow is to put the arrow in the position to fly straight and far, right? And so there is that, tension is the right word, where it's like, as long as I'm holding on to the arrow, I'm able to help guide it. I'm able to point it in a certain direction. Depending on how I pull back, you wanted to break that down. Maybe the string is your parenting style, right? Like how hard you pull back, how far you pull back, what
Mm.
direction you're pointing in. But then ultimately, you have to let go. You have to let go and let the thing fly as it's going to fly. Um, and that's just part of the deal, right?
Yeah, it's good. How about you, Evan?
I wrote this thing a while back that I thought of as you were talking, and so I pulled it up. I had posted it on my wife and I's Instagram. Looks like 117 weeks ago. So this was about just after Olive was born, and I I'll read a little segment of it, and then if there's more to say, I will say, and if not, then I'll leave it. To choose danger, we must first know safety. To enter the unknown, we must first experience knowing. To give love, we must first accept love. To me, these are all way. To me, these are all three ways of saying the same thing, and this photo represents them all. And the photo is me holding Olive in my arms, and we're at the beach. So there's this just vast ocean in front of us. The beach to me is the threshold between the known and the unknown. The land where we live life and the danger and unknown of this vast body of water. For all of human history, I think it's still very unknown to us. So quite literally and metaphorically. So kind of looking off, holding Olive as a very young baby, looking off into the unknown, standing on this threshold. So, and then I write, being a father has caused me to pay closer attention to father figures in nature, fairy tales, mythology, and religion. The role of the father is often that of protector, teacher, guardian, and guide. He says what is, and it is. He draws a boundary and says, do not cross this line. These lines are always put in place for good reason. The father has seen firsthand what is on the other side and knows the danger in venturing too far off course. Safety and security are on his mind often. We know from these stories that the line must be crossed. And this is the part where it's like, this is where I get into fatherhood. Because like the drawing of the line is the first half of fatherhood. It is the pulling back of the bow and pointing in a direction. The line being crossed at some point in time is when I think the journey becomes more real. And well, that's not a good way to say it because both are very real and very important. I didn't think about this part of the journey for a long time when I thought of fatherhood. That's a better way to say that. We know from these stories that the line must be crossed. The child matures and follows the wisp into the forest, leaves the sacred island for the unknown ocean. I'm leaning into Disney movies that I was watching at the
great.
time. Spends time in the wilderness or leaves home too soon, endangering herself in the process. This is our journey and the journey of our children, to leave safety and experience danger, to leave the known and enter the unknown, to accept love and give love. So that I haven't put into better words what it means to be, what it means to me to be a father, like the drawing of the lines and creation of boundaries with the full knowledge and acceptance that those boundaries will be crossed one day. It's like, do not cross the road. Don't do that. One day you will, that's not going to be relevant anymore, and you will be crossing the road on your own without me holding your hand.
Great. One of my really good friends, his name's Matt Hangen. We were talking one time about parenthood, and he's like, me and my wife changed a lot of our approach once we aligned on our primary responsibility. He's like, our responsibility isn't like, taking care of them on their day to day and just like, making sure everything's done for them and all that good stuff. He's like, our responsibility is preparing them for when they leave the house. And once they aligned on that like future trajectory and that threshold moment for them, it changed how they approach parenting on a day-to-day basis. And so I think about that a lot. I'm like, I could coddle like I want to pick my kid up and coddle him and hold him. And but that's actually not helping him on his path. And so it brings some context to your decisions today. If you're a little off in terms of where you want that arrow to land. So that
I
was
heard
really, really good, Evan. I like that a lot.
thanks. I like what your friend Matt, you said
Yeah.
Matt said as well. I heard this past week somebody say a similar sentiment, like I'm raising I'm not trying to raise a happy teenager. I'm trying to raise a well-rounded 40-year-old, like so that whenever they're 40, they are emotionally healthy and have the tools in their tool belt. That stuck with me as well. And then that made me think of something else. Oh, I was really excited about it. Hang on. Okay, so Josh was talking about his friend.
No, it's helping, Tony. Keep doing it. It's really helping, Evan. Do you want me to chat while you're thinking, or is it on the tip of your tongue?
It's not. Yeah, go ahead. I'm going to continue to try to get there though. But yes, let's just pick us up, Josh.
Um, yeah, while you were talking about those different thresholds, I was thinking about my own experience and kind of when I think I saw that look on my dad's face when maybe I moved away. So originally from St. Louis, Missouri, lived there all my life, went to school there. And when I was 26, 27, my wife and I moved out to Portland, Oregon. And at this time, me and my dad had started a company together, business partners. We did a ton of things together. And I remember sitting with him at a Panera, and I told him that I was going to be moving. And the look on his face was just like, why are you moving away? Like, this is going to change everything. And that was a really like hard moment. I was like so nervous to tell him, even though nothing really was going to change from a work standpoint. It's not like I was moving away from that. It was just we were going to try something different. And so the picture that I'm pointing at, if you're watching this recording, that's a picture of Mount Hood. And Mount Hood, I think, forged me in like a journey to become a dad and a man. Like I had a couple experiences on that mountain that kind of helped me realize that I was away from home. It was no longer safe anymore. And so, yeah, this one time, me, my wife, and my brother, we summited Mount Hood, and we got caught in this gnarly, whiteout condition, 60-mile-an-hour winds. Very scary moment. Yeah, I could go on a lot about that, but after that moment, Mount Hood said, okay, you're moving on now. And so now I know like there's all these different moments that I can think of. So on January 1st of 2018, the year that Jack was born, I climbed up to just the base of the summit. So I didn't actually go and summit it, but super cold. I hiked up there by myself, and I wanted to record a video for Jack. And so I remember the year of the year that he was going to be born, I left him this, video message that I've maybe watched like twice since then. But because Mount Hood helped me realize that I was away from home and it was going to be dangerous, I wanted to also like impart that, like use that same mountain as a teaching lesson to say, you have to find your own path. But I need to watch that video again because I think I cried a lot during it. But it's different. Once you make the decision as a man to move away, you realize how dangerous it can be. But that's what we're training these kids for, to move away, to be their own people, to be full versions of themselves.
Yes. Yep. There's I don't remember where I'm getting this from. I'm not this isn't from me though. If it's good, it's not. If it's good, it's from me. If it's not, it's not from me. No. This balance of messaging from parents to children, which is like a divine feminine message and a divine masculine. So I'm not, what I'm not saying here is like this message is from dad and this message is from mom. I think both parents embody equally the balance of these two things, but one is a very masculine message and one is a very feminine message, which is to say I'm constantly like trying to say both of these things. You are perfect as you are. There's nothing you need to do to change to make me love you anymore. You can be better. There are things you can do to improve yourself. And those two things, like those two messages, seem to keep us from living solely in the like coddling, like you're perfect as you are, you never like that, like only receiving that message for all of adolescence seems harmful, and only receiving the message that you can be better seems harmful. So it is there's something in me now, whoever gave me this language, it comes up often.
Yeah.
And I really am trying to balance those two messages, and not just from me, but from Grace and I. This is a conversation we have as well. How can we balance those two things and what we say and do with our children?
That seems like kind of what Tony was saying with the bow and arrow, like that you're perfect. It's just like leaving the air in the quiver, whereas like you can be better is the bending of the bow. But it's really good advice. Really good advice.
Wilder's about to turn 4 next month, and I see in him his father's uncoachability, where I didn't realize this growing up, but I was uncoachable. My ego was so prominent, and I like how you describe that that tension, Evan, of the like you're perfect as you are and you could be better. I think I got too much of the former and not enough of the latter, in a way that the way I remember, and this came up, in academics, it came up in sports, where I just I wasn't going to listen to too much, and it really did. It hindered me as a student, and I think it like ended me as a soccer player. Ultimately, it just I didn't go nearly as far as I could have, because I wasn't willing to do what it took to get better, because I didn't think I needed other people to help me to get better. If
How
that
does the
makes
best
sense.
get better?
Exactly. Yeah. I'm so awesome. We'll
Yeah.
just, clearly I'm the one who's in the best position to do that. And I'm seeing that in this little punk. And I'm like, we're not doing that, buddy. Like, it's a hard thing to know how to. My parenting style tends to be pretty laid back, and I don't raise my voice. I don't get angry, but I am trying to find the place of imposing my will, right? In a way of saying we're just not doing that. Right? That's not good for you. And to that point of wanting to raise a well-adjusted 40-year-old, the way I'm thinking about it is, how do I raise my children in a way that they don't have to go through their 20s the way that I went through my 20s, of just needing to get my ass kicked over and over, to teach myself a little bit of humility, and to teach myself to have a healthy sense of ego, while also an proper understanding of my place in the world, which is to say, I am not at the center of the world, right? I am just like everybody else. I am just a guy out here trying to do the best I can. Um, I'll pause there as I'm jabbering.
That I mean, everything you're talking about seems like what we're doing with Wilds in the Woods for ourselves still.
Mhm.
uh,
Yeah. Well, and my son, I think we've talked about this, but his name is inspired by Iron John, right? That we named him after the wild man. And the idea being that I want my son to be a wilder version of his father, like one who, um, in this story of Iron John, where the little boy, and nobody's gonna, whoever's listening, the odds that they know the story we're referring to are slim to none. But the there's this wild man in the forest, and he gets kind of brought into the kingdom and put in a cage, and the boy's ball goes in there, and he says, "Can I have my ball back?" And the wild man says, "Sure, if you let me out." And we get scared and we run away, right? And the ball is like our, what is the ball? Is the ball our wild? I mean,
The ball is like our innocence.
it's our innocence. Is that right, Evan? Yeah, I guess that's right. And then there comes a point where we do, and because in Jungian terms, this happens in like our 30s, if it does, right? It's often it is at like this turning point in life where we do let the wild man out, and then we're like, oh shit, I'm gonna be in trouble. And the wild man's like, oh yeah, good point. You better come with me. And you step out into the wilds, and start to learn how to be comfortable in that place beyond the familiar and the comfortable. And like that story resonates so much because that is what I did. Where, Josh, your story about telling your dad you were moving to Portland, I was telling my dad that I was quitting my job as an attorney and taking a backpack and just going to Southeast Asia for a year. And that was challenging for him. That was really challenging. But that was me going off with the wild. And what I learned out there in that, what turned into 4 years, was absolutely essential to becoming a fuller version of myself and preparing me to be a father. To your point about Mount Hood, Josh, right? There are places out there where I learned uh, new levels of clarity of who I wanted to be and what I wanted my life to look like.
Yeah. Yeah. Evan, you kicked off the framing of this topic, and mentioned like our dads and what we have taken from them. And when Tony was talking, it made me think about the things that I really admire about my dad, and that like he was not happy that I was moving to Portland, and he dealt with his own emotions with it, but then he let me do it. It sounds weird saying like, oh, my dad let me do it, but like it was a letting, it was a blessing. It was like, okay, go do your thing. And I think that's what I mean by letting. And I just admire that a ton. And that like he comes and visits, all the time, even here, right? So he prioritizes coming to me to see what I'm building, and he did the same thing, right? When he and my mom got married, they moved from California to Missouri. And so, it's kind of cool to see, those blessings and, enabling somebody to move on. Um, and then the other thing, when Tony was talking, it made me think about my soccer coach in high school. And I got to play for him, and then I got to coach with him after I graduated college. So I had about a decade worth of coaching with this guy who I really admired. And one thing he always talked about was it didn't matter when these, like, we taught about life through soccer. And it didn't matter when the lessons sunk in. It could be 20 years from now. Like they might have been an arrogant player all throughout their 4 years of high school soccer. but hopefully, 20 years down the road, that lesson that Coach Vitello taught them actually sunk in. And I think a lot of that is here too, where you're right in that advice, Evan. We're trying to change, or create healthy 40-year-olds. And that might be how long it takes to have some of the lessons, but we got to stick true to those lessons and, teach them and learn from them. And so yeah, I had two, like, really a lot of good fatherly figures in my life, but those two things really stood out to something that I try to embody with my kids. That always reminded myself it's not about tomorrow. It is about, at some point in the future, hopefully these lessons that I'm teaching them sink and they stick.
Yeah. And then you have to deal with the consequences of those lessons sticking, which is them coming to you and saying, I'm moving away, or I'm going to I'm going to Southeast Asia for a year, or I'm quitting my job and buying an RV to travel for a little bit. And all of our fathers seem to deal with those consequences of the good lessons that came from earlier in our life, which uh, I attempt to keep in mind. It's like, if I'm actually succeeding in some way at this well-adjusted 40-year-old, it means eventually they're going to make a decision that means they're leaving the quiver, which that is an very intriguing. I could think about that. I probably need to think about that a lot, uh, to celebrate that moment or respond. So whenever I told my dad, Grace and I were quitting our jobs at the same time to buy an RV, travel around the country, and I wanted him to ask me questions. So my question to him was, what questions do you have for me? What am I not thinking about that you're thinking about in this moment? And he said, well, give me some time and I'll come back to you, which I admire his ability for all of my life to respond calmly and leave space before responding. And I look to do that with my children as well. So then he sends me an email and he's like, I've just got one question. And I think it embodies all the other questions that I could think of. And it is like, have you ever spent a night in an RV before? And to which my answer was no. And so he goes, okay, would you consider doing that before making this big decision? It's like, absolutely. So we rented, Grace and I are like, that's really good advice. So we rented an RV for a week to see what it was like to live in an RV. And it honestly gave us so much more confidence too. Like, we knew this was what we were going to do while we were in that rental, sleeping in a vineyard in Tennessee. It's like the dogs running around a field. It was confirmed. So he helped us confirm and have confidence in our decision.
Yeah.
And in no way was attempting to keep us from doing it by asking that question, which is just a well thought out question from a dad as kids are doing something that could seem silly, or whatever. So anyways, that's what that made me think of.
It's a great question.
Um, my parents, that takes me back to when we were looking at colleges, and I say we, and me and my sister Christy are only about 14 months apart, so our searches were around the same time. And like, while going to a competitive high school in St. Louis, I remember I never really thought about going to Ivy League or trying to get into like the best school I could. Um, my dad's attitude toward it was very practical, right? Like, go get the degree you need, but the degree is just like the education and the degree are just what you need to be able to go do the work. And I kind of asked backward on my understanding of that, but did end up taking his advice on that for undergrad in a way that served me very well. but then I didn't do it for law school. I ended up spending way too much on law school. But yeah, just that practical question around like, why would you need to spend $130,000 on your undergrad degree when you want to be a writer? Like, why would you do that? That's one that I was lucky stuck.
Yeah, dads ask good questions. Good dads ask good questions. It can be like a parting thought there.
And a t-shirt.
Yes, good dads ask good questions.
So check in with the Wilds in the Woods merch store, found at wildsinthewoods.com.
We don't have that shirt yet.
What was the moose shirt? I tried to think of it last week. You guys were doing this. And then we had an idea for a shirt. You said something whenever you were doing this.
I hope we remember.
We have a lot of good ideas on this podcast.
Yeah. I don't know if we were even recording at that point either.
I don't think we were.
Oh man. Okay. Well, thanks for listening to the Wilds and the Woods podcast.
Ow! That's moose sound.
Yes. Got some fun stuff coming up from now to the end of the year into the new year that we are going to talk about after we stop recording here. So if you want to learn about what we're going to be doing in 2023, sign up for our email list at wildsinthewoods.com. Peace out, everybody.
Bye.